Good morning, friends. Here we are again, living in the light. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to attune our hearts and minds to your living presence within, that we may always remember with every breath, with every thought, that we are your children and that you are guiding us. Help us to live in thy light. Om. Peace. Amen. I just had an interesting thought. When Swamiji used to, let me think about this. The idea of calling these programs Living in the Light just sort of popped into my head at one point, and that's what we've been calling them now since we changed from Shelter in Place, because Shelter in Place had become quite old, and this seemed to be going on much longer than any of us expected, longer than I expected. This is kind of a subtle thought, but since we're talking about attunement, this is what made me think of it. A different work that I would do at different times, different writing. I remember I wrote some little something Swami had asked me to write. And he said about it afterwards, the phrase he used was, he said, it's fine. He said, it's mental, but it's fine. He said, you can publish it if you want to, which I never did. It was a little story. He'd asked me to write a children's story of all things, so I wrote one. And it was fine, but it was mental. That's the word he used. And I sort of understood what he meant, but I was just thinking about it just now. Whenever Swami would suggest titles or things like that, I would always want them to be stunningly original. And sometimes when the words were not, startlingly unique, I would not like them, and I would sort of resist them. And even though, to use Swami's own words, I thwarted him on many occasions by my strong-minded opposition based on nothing but whimsy, often he would just prevail. But I was just feeling the difference there, because Living in the Light is a fairly obvious title. It just is, Living in the Light, there it is. Except it just seemed to me like the right title, and I didn't think twice about it. But earlier in my life, I would have imposed a mental construct on that, which is that I would have rejected it because it was too obvious. But sometimes obvious is correct. That's what I was realizing. Original is to be sincerely coming from your point of origin. It's not to do something that's never been done before. Countless times I've repeated that, but I'm only looking backwards and seeing that I was trying to do things that had never been done before, even though original sometimes was perfectly obvious. I hope that's meaningful to you. It means a lot to me. What's been happening to me through a lot of these morning conversations with all of you is that I've been learning lots of things. It's just, perhaps it's the time of my life, maybe it's the astrological period that I'm in, but it's nice to have confusions from the past somewhat resolved, because it's interesting to me. First, I'll speak of it in terms of writing. I recently have had to write a letter that some of you are part of Palo Alto will be getting. It's just an update on what's going on in our community. It's a pretty simple letter. And I worked on it over the course of a week or so. And working on it means this: I think it's finished, and then certain phrases just keep nagging at me. They just keep nagging at me until I fix them, and then they just go away. When I was writing Light Bearer, I absolutely found that to be true. Just I would work on it, and then certain phrases would just keep nagging at me until I went back and fixed them. And then once I fixed them, they went away completely. It wasn't like I was constantly tinkering. It was that things weren't as they were meant to be. And then once they were as they were meant to be, then they just went away completely. In fact, the whole book, Light Bearer, in a certain way, has just gone away because now it's the way it's meant to be. And it's not a theoretical concept. It's just an actual. It speaks to you rather than you imposing your will upon it. And the whole, it's all about attunement. I mean, that process is all about attunement. There was another thought I had here that I wanted. Oh yes, this was just interesting. This was I've mentioned many times that Swami spent years teaching me to write, and it was a very hard struggle for me. Now it seems insignificant, but it wasn't when it happened. When Swami rejected that particular little story because it was mental, I knew it was. I never doubted his appraisal. His appraisal was always true, even if I didn't get it until he said it. Then as soon as he said it, there would be a thought transference and I would get it. But I remember how disappointed I was because I had wanted to succeed. Isn't it funny? I can even feel it inside me. I had wanted to succeed. I realized I hadn't, and so I just had to face into it that I hadn't. But I think it might have even been that very same visit. We were engaged in, or it was around the same time, we were engaged in the SRF lawsuit at that time, and Swamiji, something had happened, and it was necessary for a number of us to respond to it. One of our peers in SRF, Swami was always dealing with Dayamata and the board of directors, and then there was a second tier of renunciates, which were basically our peers, so they were our people to talk to. And one of them had written a letter that was just really inappropriate. And it was necessary for a number of us to respond, and the letters needed to be done at a certain time. And just the humor of it, everyone was going to town with Swamiji for lunch that day, but I needed to get this letter done, and I did not want to miss the town trip. So I got up like at 4 in the morning and wrote the thing so that I could go to town with everyone else. And I did it, and I was pleased with it, and I brought it to Swamiji, and he was reading it over, as he always read my writing. And he went right through it. It was all just fine. And then at a certain point, he pointed to this phrase, and then he shifted it, this particular phrase. And as soon as he did it, I said, I knew there was something wrong with that. I just couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And I think this was the point at which I kind of like crossed over into like, I crested the hill of effort, and from then on it was easier. He looked at me and he said, if you could tell that there was something wrong with that phrase, he said, you're a good writer, like that. And it was just like, because I could tell there was something wrong. I couldn't yet tell how to fix it, but I could feel that. Now, because we're talking about attunement, and attunement is so sensitive, I've been trying to find all these different ways to say it and to somehow make it experiential, which is why I'm telling these personal stories, because that's how it happens for me, because writing is a lot of my medium, my challenging medium. Also speaking, actually. It doesn't happen as often anymore, but things would happen where I would say something, and then for days afterwards I would realize it was the wrong thing to have said. And I would have to try to really feel inside myself what mistake I had made. There was not often much I could do about that. In this series, I realized that I'd made 2 mistakes, but they were factual mistakes rather than attunement mistakes. But sometimes attunement mistakes happen. Swamiji actually did one once. Some of you may remember it, those of you whose vintage is the same as mine. He was starting to talk about one of the other disciples and some error that the disciple had made. This was in a big public class. It might have been spiritual egoic or something big. And in the middle, Swami stopped and said, Master does not want me to speak that way about one of my Guru Bhais. And then he just went on and talked about something else. I don't ever remember him doing that before or since. But even he was going in a direction he could feel Master didn't want him to go. And for some reason he felt to speak about it rather than just shift. So these are the ways over time, step by step, we begin to have a feeling about what the right vibration is, and we sensitize ourselves to that vibration. And that's precisely what Swami's talking about here. So it's not something that someone can point to someone else and say, you're out of tune, although sometimes it may be obvious, but it's not an accusation that you place on someone else. It's not a statement that you say, I am in tune. These are much too subtle realities for the ego to be working with one way or another. But it's something we need to deeply feel and pay attention to within ourselves. Just that feeling is the only way I can call it. And we just have to become aware of that feeling. And the way we find out usually is by ignoring it and then having it haunt you. Just in the writing or in my speaking or whatever it is, or your interactions with people, when you begin to learn this, when you make mistakes, they haunt you. And then you have to work your way through not feeling haunted, but just resolving to do better the next time, unless it can be fixed. And then, of course, if it can be fixed, by all means do so. Editing a piece of writing is simple, but other things are less so. So, now, in the paragraph before, Swami said, Master would tell his students, you're not connected with a mere organization, but with the divine power flowing through a line of self-realized masters. Again, he would repeat, this work is a special dispensation sent from God. I said, Swamiji, does that mean that people get more than they deserve? I said, how can that be possible? And Swami smiled and he said, well, in a sense, that is what it means. It means that we have a karma to be in a very powerful current. And so because we're in that current, if you've ever swum with the current in a river, you understand if you swim with the current or move with the tide, your own efforts are multiplied. It's like a matching grant from the divine. You put in $1 and God puts in 3. So anyway, Swami says, inner proof of the truth of Master's assertion came to me easily. The more I attuned myself to the divine grace flowing through him, the more everything in my own life flowed smoothly. The opposite proved true also. Whenever I sought to progress spiritually by personal efforts alone, without this attunement, I found myself gradually bogging down. Now that's very interesting the way he says it. Whenever I sought to progress by my own efforts, I found myself gradually bogging down. And there's something that happens in the context of Ananda that all of us we're never quite sure how to work with it. On one hand, one of the most powerful things that we have to offer, one of the most effective ways to attract people into our spiritual family is to speak about Kriya Yoga. Master in Autobiography of a Yogi, Swami in the Path, just talk about how the practice of Kriya Yoga is such an important part of what we have to offer. Master tells the story of Lahiri Mahashaya going up to the Himalayas, being called by Babaji in this miraculous way, in this manifested golden palace. Lahiri receives this Kriya initiation, and then he's sent by Babaji back into the world to give this Kriya technique to all who sincerely seek it. Master talks about Kriya, one round of Kriya is like 1 year of right living without the corollary danger of 1 year of right living, and we work out this karma and then create this karma, which is the problem once we sort of try to work these things out, that Kriya will dissolve your karma, that it solves this seemingly insoluble problem of all these vrittis from past lives. I mean, it's magnificent. And all of the principles, everything that Master says about it is the truth. But what it inspires in people's minds is a somewhat technique-oriented point of view toward the spiritual path. And so there is this phrase, which, being a wordsmith, I try to work against this phrase, but it's hard. Oh, I'm here to get Kriya. Oh, I got Kriya. When did you get Kriya? Oh, I got Kriya. And all of that's just plain English. Maybe in other languages it sounds different. But it sounds like you came in, you got what you wanted, now you have what you wanted. And it feels too much like a thing that works on its own. And one of the issues that we have found, those of us who are in positions of responsibility and want to be fair to the people who come to us, for inspiration and for guidance, is that Kriya is just a technique. And it is absolutely integrally, inseparably involved with being a disciple. And being a disciple is inseparably involved with trying to tune in to the ray of grace that is the Guru. And what happens is people will come very avidly and will go through the proper courses until they qualify to get Kriya. And then when they get Kriya, we never see them again. And I remember going through, over the course of many decades, all of us in positions of responsibility have experimented over and over of different ways to really help people understand what it is that they are receiving and how it actually works. And how it actually works is it's a method by which you can become attuned. And it's a method by which you can open your heart. It's a method by which you can purify your heart so that you can see God. But it doesn't work if you just get it and go away with it. Now, I'm not saying that being part of an organization and showing up on Sundays and donating to support the spiritual work, I'm not saying that there is no institutional intercession required. This is one of the absolutely fundamental points that Master made about the whole path of self-realization as he's sharing it, and Kriya Yoga particularly, is that there's no priestly intercession required. One of my Indian friends remarked that the rituals of Hinduism are so complicated that you have to hire someone to do it for you. He said it's the only religion where you have to hire someone to practice it, because it's just become so overlaid with all these traditions that no ordinary layperson. This came up in the context of him having purchased a new flat, a new apartment, and needing to have the pujaris come in and dedicate it. And he had to wait for the auspicious day. Then they lit a hoven. They built a small fire inside the apartment. They broke coconuts against the walls. So after that whole thing was done, he had to repaint that whole room before they could move into it again. But none of that. It was unthinkable for him to move in without the ceremony, and there was no way he could do it himself. So one of the things that Master did not bring from India, from the ancient teachings of India, was all that priestly ritual, because Master wanted us to understand that our spiritual development is in our own hands, and that is among the powers of Kriya. And one of the dispensations that Lahiri asked for from Babaji, because Babaji said, as the Leela plays itself out, Babaji said, give this only to those who are willing to renounce the world, renounce everything for the sake of God. And Lahiri said, in so many words, I'm probably not going to be initiating very many people, because very few people are able to do that. But many sincere seekers could be helped. So Babaji said, the divine has spoken through you. So we owe Lahiri a lot, because he opened the gates for all of us to be able to affect our spiritual development by the practice of Kriya without the necessity for priestly intercession. But we don't want to misunderstand that. And by that I mean, therefore, neither Ananda nor any other organization dedicated to these teachings is necessary, and no individual is necessary. However, human nature is what it is, and especially when we are still enwrapped in Maya and still subject to many delusions, whether those delusions are actually external temptations or whether they're just the delusions of our own mind, that we begin to spin ideas and they seem like a good idea, and we just can't tell the difference. I've mentioned in this context how very fortunate I was to have peers and Swamiji to whom I could present my ideas, and they could tell me whether or not I was nuts. And of course, Swamiji was the ultimate authority, but my peers have been, and even to this day, my peers are essential to my not wandering off. Because if one is just alone in one's own mind, you see, the power of your own mind is that it's quite comfortable with itself. And so many things feel right. And many things make a lot of sense because you're all by yourself and you're just spinning your own ideas, and everything matches because there's nobody in here but me. So there's no dissonant energy at all. That's why earlier I was referring to that feeling. Because yes, it does feel right, but things can feel right with lots of gradations, lots of nuance of feeling right. And when I was working on Lightbearer, for example, I mean, I've shared this, but it's a perfect example. I wrote some sentence, and it had the phrase, the compass of devotion. I remember that phrase, which I thought was really a nice phrase. Of course, as I thought about it, it actually makes no sense at all. It really makes no sense. And so it was just one sentence in the book, or maybe it was two. It could have been a whole paragraph, but it was a short paragraph. And I just liked it. I liked the sound of it. It sounded good to me. It didn't make any sense at all. It was just the kind of writing that Swami campaigns against, where it almost means something. And because it has a few good words in it and it almost means something, there's a great temptation to leave it and just hope the reader can figure out what you meant. And so I got these sentences there, and I was really attached to them. And really, literally, Swami kept nagging at me. I was all alone, but I could hear him nagging at me. I kept defending them, and it got to be like a real conversation. I mean, he was there. We were talking as if he was in the room. I defended it. He pointed out to me that it was really terrible. And then he challenged me to explain to him what it meant. By now, I'm laughing, too. I couldn't explain what it meant because I didn't know what it meant. It was just a bunch of words that sounded good together. And finally, when it got to be really humorous, I said, all right, I'll take it out. So I looked at it and I pulled it out. Then, of course, the subject just completely went away. But if I hadn't been listening, it would still be in the book. Because it felt right. Because it felt right to me, because I liked it. But I was listening and I heard him in there. So back to the Kriya issue. The whole thing about Kriya, I knew where I was starting to say. There was a point in time when we wanted to make, and maybe we still do, I'm not involved on the details anymore, we wanted to make becoming a member of Ananda, which is a supporting member. You donate, you support the spiritual. We wanted to make that a requirement for taking Kriya. And it was complicated, and people who wanted to get Kriya, some of them didn't want to become members. And I think eventually we had to drop it because it was too much of a contradiction. It was too institutional. But it wasn't that we wanted to require them to be members. We wanted to explain to them that you will want to become a member. You will want to continue to participate. You will want to have satsang. You will want to keep yourself inspired. You will want to have an environment in which you can continue to learn. And if you just get Kriya and then go away and practice it, I'm sure there are exceptions. But our observation, those of us who've been around for many years, is it doesn't work out as well as people think it's going to work. Because attunement and the relationship with the masters, which is a living, ongoing presence. It was the same thing for requiring people to take the Raja Yoga course. And I would say to them, you should want to take the Raja Yoga course. You should want to know as much. And if you don't want to, you have to think about what you're doing. Why are you doing it? How do you think this is going to work? And it would just be so impressive to me how people would read Autobiography of a Yogi and then be an authority on what Kriya was. And I'll go back over to here. They gain the most who seek attunement with others more advanced than they themselves on the path. So people would come in, having read Autobiography of a Yogi, feeling an attunement with this path, which they have every right to do. Discipleship to master, that's between you and God. And then they would come in and they would tell us what was required. And when we would contradict anything that they said, they would argue or simply refuse to cooperate, sometimes boldly and blatantly, and sometimes just subtly. But those who also strive to be in tune, or at least for heaven's sakes to listen to someone who's been doing this for, at least an hour longer than you have, maybe there is something there. Swamiji had every right in the world to make his own decisions directly from Master, but he was astonishingly humble. Given the clarity of his own intuition, he was astonishingly humble because it was his job to show us what it meant to be a disciple. But he was also astonishingly humble because he was. Because God could speak to him, Master could speak to him about what he ought to do, but other people could also get true messages. It's possible to learn. And once we decide that I'm the only source, then there's a billion or so, or how many billions of people there are out there. We've just cut ourselves down to something so small. So on one hand, and Swami says it right here, this is this ray of grace, this is this special dispensation. When Master withdrew his ray, there was a dramatic shift in this woman's aura, because she didn't understand that a great deal of what she was feeling was that she was floating in the river of his energy. And this is how Swami puts this very interesting question. When I just tried to progress on my own, he never explains exactly what that means. So each of us has to sort of figure that out, what it means to be just progressing on our own. Just what does it feel like when we've enclosed ourselves and we've rejected input? That doesn't mean, and see, these are the balancing lines. A lot of people are often wrong. And just because they feel strongly about something doesn't mean that their point of view is stronger than yours. This is the wrong kind of obedience. Just that we surrender our will. That's why the path of self-realization, especially the path of self-realization as practiced at Ananda, is not easy. And it's not a mass movement, because you can't just find the external rules. What you find is Swamiji will talk to us, and he'll explain to us what Master means, and he presents Master's own words in the books that Swami has written. And there are other sources of Master's words, but I prefer to start with the things that Swamiji says, or the interpretation of the Gita that Swami has written. I feel more in tune, that's the right way to put it. I feel more in tune with Master, the way Swamiji explains him to me, than I do when I hear him explained from other sources. It's more my way of doing it. Let's see now, I lost the thought that I was saying there. Oh, it's yes, what Swami was saying about we move in this river, and it's if we are too isolated in ourselves, we have so much danger of increasing the ego rather than transcending it. And Swami talks about that a little later in this brochure, and we'll talk about it more. And it's also, there's a lot of fear. Fear is the opposite of divine love. And we've all been hurt and misguided a lot in the past. We've all made mistakes in the past. And part of the I'm going to use that word that's so popular, the healing process of being on the spiritual path, is to not be afraid anymore. And just have a close enough inner tie with the divine that we don't have to protect ourselves. That inner magnetism becomes the only protection we need. That's why Swami was so humble and so open, because he rested so comfortably in his relationship with Master that he didn't have to protect it. He could just openly, with great interest and genuine receptivity, look for Master's guidance in every direction, because he had a core within him. He knew what the right note was. He could hear Master's voice within him, and everything that came through could be balanced in regard to that. But even Swami tells that story, which I told a little while ago, or a few sessions ago, about accepting an initiation from a disciple of Lahiri Mahashaya, and then after 6 months realizing that was a mistake. He too could do something that seemed like a right idea, but created a dissonance. And that's what we all have to be working with. Well, that's enough for this morning. I'll talk to you tomorrow. God bless you.